How's it going, guys? So this is going to be the first episode of what we are going to call Audio Dojo. Now, what I'm planning on Audio Dojo being is I kind of want it to be something where you guys are able to learn mixing and mastering and audio engineering in general from the beginning and then move on to more advanced techniques so you can kind of get the grasp of the beginning stuff before you move into the more complicated stuff. I feel like once you're able to get the stuff like EQ, compressing, just navigating your program in general, you'll be able to make better mixes along the way if you don't skip those steps. Because obviously you kind of need them. But, so since this is the first episode, the topic we're going to be covering is the overview of mixing and mastering. Now, this episode is also just going to be an introduction to sound engineering in general, because if you're somebody who's thinking about getting into it or wants to get into it, this will be something, this entire series is going to be something that's good for you. So, but I'll continue that in more episodes. So, when you're thinking about mixing, the best way that I've learned to do it is to think about mixing like a puzzle, and each individual track is its own puzzle piece. Now, the benefit of thinking like this is you can think about EQing parts out of some tracks as carving out the sides of a puzzle piece so other puzzle pieces can fit together. Now, let's take a step back and think that when all these puzzle pieces have parts carved out of them, you're basically carving out part of the sound that would normally get in the way of another sound, thus the fitting together of the puzzle pieces. This is the main thing, and if you don't learn anything from any of these classes, remember this, because just remembering this will give you a good start up to be able to get any of your tracks together. Basically, you don't want any sounds to be interfering with each other. You don't want them to even have any sort of muddiness to them at all, because once they're layering on top of each other, it just makes it sound bad. Every sound has to fit in its own space, but they're all making up the entire track, which is the puzzle, quote unquote. Now, if we're starting with mixing, the best way I've learned to think about mixing is just making the individual tracks as clear as possible working together. Now that means we're not working with the master track when it comes to mixing. You're going to be making all of these tracks sound good, clear, not only alone, soloing, but say in this track that I have right now up, that's actually the track outs to Linkin Park's Numb, if you're familiar with that song. We got drums, bass, guitar, vocals, keys, and additional instruments. Now, all of these sounds have their own space in the mix, and they're all clear on their own, but not only are they clear on their own, but the drums sound clear when the bass is playing, because the bass isn't taking up any part of the drums frequencies, and the guitar sounds good when both of these are playing because it doesn't take up any of the same frequencies, and so on and so on. So basically the main thing to remember is take advantage of EQs and make sure that no tracks are getting in the way of each other. Now, what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to play you, say, the vocals first, bring up the EQ for the spectrum. We're going to think about what's actually going on right now. So, let's just play the first verse. Yeah, I'm going to take this cut off that I put right here. Now, we can kind of tell that the main parts that are hitting, it's above 200 and below about 16K. Now, you can still see there's some bottom end, which means that the engineer who engineered this didn't cut it, but it's definitely possible that he decreased it a little bit, or we don't know his exact chain, but we can kind of tell from what's going on. It's definitely in between 200 and 16K for the most part. The peaks of this are in similar places throughout the entire track for the vocals, which means that it's hitting the same decibel level. Now this means that a compressor was used on it, as with most professional vocals, if not every single one. Compressing is basically what you're going to use to bring out everything that you didn't cut. Now say we're going to cut it like at 200. This isn't what they did, but this is just an example. We're cutting it about right here, so this is the main part of it. say there wasn't anything below during this cut, you would compress this stuff to make it come out more, to make more clarity. Then another thing you could do that I've learned was the best chain for mixing would be to EQ to cut, then bring up a compressor if you're using Logic, Pro Tools, Cubase, Fruity Loops, Ableton, anything like that. You compress what you have left, and then if needed, you can use another separate EQ after the compressor to bring down or bring up anything that you would think is best, if that makes sense. So EQing first, then compressing, then EQing to fine-tune, because the EQ that comes after the compressor is affected by the compressor. So the only real idea of the first EQ would be get out anything and everything that's completely unnecessary. So I hope that gave you at least a general idea of what's going on in the mixing process. I'm going to be covering that in depth in the next episode for mixing, but right now we're going to move over to mastering. Now, the idea of if mixing is making the individual tracks as clear as possible working together, then mastering would be making the entire track sound as full and powerful dynamically as you can make it. Now, basically, the best way that I think about it is that a good mix is not only clear, but is full. And I'm sure you think the same way. Anything you hear on the radio, anything professionally mixed that you really listen to is going to not only sound clear, but kind of hit hard. It punches. You could hear everything the way it's supposed to be heard. The things that are supposed to be loud are supposed to be loud. Anything in the back is supposed to be back. It's very, very precise when it comes to all this stuff. Now, if EQ, compression, then EQ is the chain for mixing, one that I've learned for mastering is you use a gain for power, then what's called a multi-band compressor to kind of color the sounds that you want to sound well. Then you can use another EQ on the master track for a little bit even more coloring that's not done by the multi-band compressor. And at the end, you do a limiter to bring out what's left in the track and to prevent clipping. Now, I'm going to go into that also in the mastering class itself, but for preventing the clipping, all clipping is basically too much information going into the computer or program, and it begins distorting. And distortion has its place, but never ever on the master track. You don't want, you've probably at one point or another, if you're kind of experienced or have done this for a little bit, exported a mixer and master track and it just doesn't sound well because it's loud, but it's really not it's not powerful and full. There's a difference between loud and then powerful. When it's loud, it can clip, and you'll know that there is this bar right over here is green right now, but once it passes 0 decibels, it's going to start clipping, and we'll cover that more in later tutorials. Overall thing to remember is that both should remain separate. Mixing and mastering should remain separate, but both are still necessary. You shouldn't mix without mastering and shouldn't master without mixing, because you can't really get away with just doing one of them. To make the best, you could have clear but not full, and full but not clear. You need both to have a professional sounding mix. Now, another thing to remember just for starting off is, I know it's awesome to be listening to your songs super loud, and I used to do that, and I still do that sometimes, to just be blasting it, because that has its place. But when you think of yourself as a mixing engineer, you have to hear the song for what it is. And it's easier to perceive the sound when it's all at a low volume and you can actually take it in for what it is. Plus, you don't ruin your ears, and that's way better. So the main thing to remember is thinking of mixing like a puzzle, and mixing as individual tracks, mastering as a master track, and I'll see you guys in the next episode. Thanks.